Hey, Randy Joe here, and this is 1001 Reviews, the series where I plan on reviewing every single album from the 1001 Albums Listened to Before You Die book. And today we're looking at Pearl Jam's debut 1991 album, 10. 10 was released under the Epic label, produced by Rick Paharashar with Pearl Jam, art direction Jeff Ament, nationality USA, and a running time of 50 minutes and 46 seconds. Now I'm going to get right to the point here and say that over the week, having listened to this album multiple times over and having done a lot of research on this album and the band itself, I came to the realization that Pearl Jam is the band that you either love every aspect of them or you absolutely hate them. And unfortunately, if you're coming to this as a huge Pearl Jam fan, I'm sorry to let you down and say that this is not an album that I enjoyed, nor do I think Pearl Jam is a very noteworthy band. In fact, I'd go as far to say that this isn't necessarily even a good album. Rather, it is only a very good commercially successful album, which I guess counts for something if that is exactly what you want from your music, is to appeal to the lowest common denominator and the widest appeal possible. For the most part, everything about this album really feels like everything I dislike about the late 90s to early 2000s music scene, especially everything that comes with the post-grunge genre, maybe one of the worst genres in music. And I think that is most notably obvious with the influence that bands such as Creed, Nickelback, and Theory of a Dead Man might take with Eddie Vedder's voice, for example, from this album and band in general. Because Eddie Vedder's voice is not at all engaging to me. In fact, it is incredibly whiny and grating and just too strong on the voice inflections, and not necessarily in a interesting or stylistic way. It feels as if it is very nasal and just guttural. It is gross and doesn't feel at all appealing to the ear. There's no sense of smoothness to it, and there's no sense of complete absurdity to it either, that at least makes it a bit more tolerable in a stylistic way. I mean, arguably the greatest hit from Pearl Jam in general is the song Alive, which is the third song of this album. And this is a great song to really just show off what I hate about Eddie Vedder's voice, with the way he extends his words and almost moans them out in this almost difficult to pronounce sort of way. He feels as if he is forced against his will to sing most of these lyrics and does not sound at all interested in what he himself is trying to vocalize here. Instrumentally, Alive again feels like it is something that is meant to again appeal to a radio-friendly audience. It is absolutely bare bones and generic for the most part, and doesn't really shift into any interesting aspects. It doesn't feel like it's showcasing off any of the talents of the band, but feels as if they are all meant to just sound as if they are playing in the most natural and matter-of-fact way. But that's not to say that every song off this album is boring or bland or generic to me. There are a few songs off here that I think are at least passable. The hit Even Flow, despite again sounding just as stupid as anything else on this album, I do find Eddie Vedder's voice to be a little bit more tolerable here, at least in the chorus, as he kind of shifts away from his annoying nasally approach and carries on a bit more of a steady note for once. And on top of that, the riffs throughout this song I think are pretty iconic at this point and are well known and ingrained into most music listeners' brain if you have heard pretty much any radio ever in the past 20 years. This guitar riff throughout is pretty iconic for a good reason, because I do think this is one of the best riffs off the album, and just an overall great example of 90s music in general, as it does capture a certain essence that only exists in the early 90s grunge scene. And also the seventh song here, Oceans, I also think is pretty interesting as well, especially with the slower aspects. And this is where I find Pearl Jam to be much more interesting than anywhere else on the album, is when they take their time and they go a bit more slower with the instrumentation and the vocalizations of Eddie Vedder. And it's just far more intriguing and stands out a bit more among this overall hogwash of just generic sounding mess that is most of this album. And on top of that, you do have to take into account the amount of influence that this album did have in the late 90s to early 2000s music scene. And even though I don't necessarily enjoy it, and I don't know if most people do, it is definitely there. It definitely exists. So there's definitely some sort of place for Pearl Jam for someone. It's just that someone is definitely not me. So for me, really, the soft rating of this album came to a 4.1 out of 10. I did not enjoy it. I do think it is a below average album, hence being below 5. And the hard rating of this album as well will be a 4 out of 10. And on top of that, again, arguing, is it really essential to listen to before you die? Is it a must listen to hear before you die? On one hand, I would say that it isn't, because I don't really care for it myself at all. But on the other hand, this is a pretty massive influential album on the likes of the post-grunge scene, especially with bands like Creed, Nickelback, Three Doors Down, Theory of a Dead Man, Puddle of Mud. And even though I think these are all terrible bands and I don't enjoy them at all in the slightest, I can't pretend as if they didn't exist in the music scene in some capacity in the early 2000s. So I would say this is an essential listen. Maybe just once. I don't enjoy it. I'll never listen to it again. But it gave me some context on a genre that I previously did not care for. I still don't care for that genre, but at least I understand it a bit more, and I can understand where the impact came from. And I think as a music listener, that is an important thing to gather from an album. So yeah, lowest rating I've given so far, and it is also essential. Who would have thought? And yeah, if you're a huge Pearl Jam fan, I would like to offer my apologies that I could not give this album the praise that you probably desired. However, I'm glad you enjoy it. You know, that's something. All right, random number generator, 1 to 1001. Generate 964, which will be the album. 964 being Fleet Foxes' self-titled album, Fleet Foxes. So go ahead and give that a listen, and I'll review that in about 1 week from now. That pretty much does it for this video. Please hit like and subscribe if you want to follow along in listening to every album from the 1001 Albums to Listen to Before You Die book. And as always, my name is Randy Joe, and I'm signing off.